All right. Welcome to Gen TV. My name is Malik Lenzonzo. Tonight, another great show. Just to let you know that my friend, Mr. Paul Pumphrey, is back in the States after many trips abroad. Is always ongoing when it comes to, giving his contribution to humankind. We can talk about politics here in Washington, D.C. We see Paul Humphrey almost everywhere. Now, something I think we should have done is actually is to give some kind of a background about this brother. It's very important. We have to know that Mr. Paul Pumphrey is actually the co-founder and board member of a Friend of Congo. He has been an organizer, an activist for over 40 years. That's a lot. In 1998, Mr. Pumphrey co-founded the Brother and Sister International, as a 501c3 nonprofit organization was focused as economic development, human rights in America, the Caribbean, and Africa. So that give you a little bit a synopsis of the man that you're gonna interact with in the next 45 minutes. Welcome back to the show, my brother.
Well, I'm glad to be back. It's been a little busy, but again, I'm glad to be back and to be able to share some information with the audience.
Absolutely. Listen, my understanding is that although you were invited to the show, but because you always somebody has to pull you somewhere, and always present to any battlefield. I understand that you just came from a rally, a protest. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on?
Yes, well, for those who have been in the DC area and watched the news today, you may have heard that, in fact, the Cuban embassy was attacked last night with people throwing Molotov cocktails. That's a glass bottle full of inflammable material that is lit and then thrown up against the building, seeking to try to set the building on fire. And two of them were lobbed to the Cuban embassy last night. And so there was a call put out by people who believe in peace and justice to ask people to actually come to the Cuban embassy and let it be known that there are people here in the United States that have supported the humane activities of Cuba has done around the world. And I remember back at the time of the COVID epidemic, Cuba, in fact, was invited to Italy because Italy had been hit very hard by the COVID. And I saw a video of when the Cubans had landed at the airport and they were coming off their plane in the airport. The
Single
Italians,
version, yeah.
the Italians stood up and applauded them for
Yeah.
coming to help them with the problems they were having with COVID in their country.
But what a minute, Paul, because this is serious. I know we're here today to talk about international politics and economics, mainly in Africa. This is just some kind of a because I told people already how busy you are. Before coming on the show, you were already on that rally at the Cuban embassy. But when you mentioned the cocktail Molotov, that it became serious. That can be related to a terrorist activity. Who does something like that on American soil? What happened? Something was thrown inside of
Yes,
a
it
Cuban
was a, it
embassy.
was a glass bottle full of flammable, probably gasoline. It had a lit wick, and the idea was to throw it up against the building, which they did. Two different items up against the building. The glass would break, the flammable liquids would spread, and that the flame that was on the wick would light up and set the building on fire. of course, the Cuban embassy is made up of concrete, and it's kind of hard to try to set concrete on fire. But
Right.
nonetheless, they made that attempt last night. Now, today, when we had the demonstration, there must have been 30 policemen outside the Cuban embassy. When we had the protests over in France, there were at least 5 to 10 policemen outside the French embassy. But last night, terrorists were allowed to come and attack the Cuban embassy where there were no police to be found. Now, one kind of wonders whether or not the police was coordinating their activities with the people who were trying to set the building on fire. But that's left up for other people to figure out at this point. The
Absolutely.
problem is that when terrorism is done against Cuba, United States turn their eyes the other way and act as if they don't see what goes on. And in fact, even people who have clearly been associated with carrying out terrorist acts against the Cuban people, those people are often coming back into the United States and treated as heroes in the United States. So one has to wonder, who is really the terrorist? The country that in fact there were people who blew up a Cuban plane and killed 70 some odd people. And they came back to the United States. The United States didn't put them in jail. The United States didn't turn them over to the Cuban authorities. They just let them go around Miami and have the Cuban exile community treat them as heroes. So when you look at what happened in places like Afghanistan, what happened in Iraq, the United States killed over 1 million people in Iraq. But they don't call themselves terrorists. They have the audacity to accuse Cuba of being terrorists. Cuba has sent doctors around the world. They have trained doctors around the world to address the health needs of poor people in nations all over the world, all over Africa, all over the Caribbean, and even in Europe as well as the United States. There are doctors right now in the United States practicing medicine who got their training in Cuba for free. On the
So,
other
so
hand,
how you explain? I mean,
yeah,
I know you're trying to make a point on the goodness of what Cuba is being done, and the latest news on the power of that country, that their capacity to good in the world was during COVID. Like you said, we all saw the pictures. They went to Italy. That's the European country where they were received with standing ovation. People applauding their help to those brothers and sisters in Europe. So based on your experience and your knowledge of history, because you were a good student of history, what can we say about this um, non-ending situation? I'm talking about the embargo of the United States on Cuba. What's the basis for that?
what? There is no basis. In fact, if anyone were to describe it from my point of view, it is an act of terror against the people of Cuba. Because, like I said, one of the problems Cuba had after they had developed 5 vaccines for COVID is that they couldn't get their hands on syringes to administer the vaccine. Other countries where their doctors went to help the health industries in different countries, both in Africa, Europe, Asia, and many parts of Central America and South America. So, again, what is the real purpose for the United States policy against Cuba? Is that Cuba doesn't allow U.S. businesses to go down to Cuba and rip off their countries the same way France is doing all over Africa today? I don't see the United States putting embargoes against France for what it has done in the former in the francophone countries throughout Africa. And clearly, there have been thousands of people who have become severely ill and even died because they did not have the proper medical attention that their country could not afford because of the economic structure that France has forced many African nations into, where they can't even borrow their own money without paying interest on it. And the United States don't call that a terrorist act, even though you have thousands of people losing their lives and becoming severely ill because of the act that France has done in their country. So we really have to begin to challenge some of the policies pushed by both the Democrats and the Republicans here in the United States as to whether or not they are just or unjust. I mean, the policy of pushing the war in Afghanistan, pushing the war in Iraq, were unjust wars. And when people, large numbers of people lost their lives, and
Let,
yet
let's.
the United
I want.
States is going to call Cuba the terrorist?
I want to stay. I want to stay on France for a minute because you mentioned France many times, and as you already know, you probably already read it. Niger family successfully pushed back the French army, and it was very bizarre to see that for a long time, Niger. I've said that the ambassador of France was actually a person non grata. Person non grata is meaning that that person was not wanted in that particular place in the world. And we see the reaction from the French president completely denying. He was in a denial, that French couldn't take his troop out or even allowed his ambassador to go back to his country. All of this under the complete silence of the international community, United States. And when I say complete silence, we don't see the strong criticism when it comes to because the people in Niger, they see France as a terrorist country. They've been under economic terrorism from France. So it seems to me, as I'm listening to you, that there is a huge double standard when it comes to the way the United States deal with these countries. And stay on France for a minute and trying to speak on the willing of the people of Niger not to deal with France and their economics, terrorism they've been dealing with for years. And our friends, the United States, friend of the United States, do not really put pressure on France to just leave when Niger people, because democracy is supposed to be, the power of the people, by the people and for the people. So when the people say clearly, and they're being on the street demanding the French military, demanding the French ambassador to leave Niger, France say, "Oh no, we're not gonna do it." But finally, it looks like the military have left Niger. So, what kind of game we're playing here on the international scene, Mr. Paul?
Well, I think it's quite clear that France economy would completely fall apart if it no longer was allowed to rob the former colonial states of France and Africa. They take their money, their international currency. They force the governments to take their international currency and put it in the French banks. And once they're in the French banks, they have no control over their money. France can take and use their money as collateral for loans for France when these countries can't even use their own money. for collateral to improve the quality of lives in their own country. This is something that the media of the United States chooses not to talk about. And I think it's very important that we do talk about it because clearly it's unfair. It's unjust. You have France today has a huge deposit of gold when it doesn't have gold mines. So where's the gold coming from? It's coming from the countries in Africa in which they're giving little or no money for. France has actually set up in the constitution of many of the African countries that they cannot even look for the best deal for their phone company, for their electric company, for any of the basic utilities that those countries have, that they must first give France the option of doing that work in their countries and paying the exorbitant prices that the French companies are charging them to do that work. And often the work that is being done is inferior. And so we have a very unequal situation. We have a situation where the United States looks the other way when France violates the human rights of the many countries such as Mali, Gabon, um, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and the list goes on. The Central African Republic, Chad. These are countries that are being bled of their natural resources on a daily basis and not being fairly compensated for their natural resources. And then their
Absolutely.
people end up suffering because of this. And the United States does not consider that a terrorist act. I would, because it's
Absolutely.
threatening causing people's lives, innocent people's lives, when France are robbing their country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. During this, the UN session this year, we've seen leaders rose up, and continue to denounce, these practices. And as one of the leader, one of the leaders from Africa, I think Burkina Faso, was just mentioning and talking about the hypocrisy, even at the UN, the the organization that was built, created to kind of bring peace around the world. But when we see, the one eye kind of policy, they would close the eye on one side of a, situation when they're completely hard on the others. Remember in 2001 when our president, back then, the former president, George Bush, went to Iraq, and then we were all convinced that that was an Operation Freedom. That Saddam Hussein was a dictator that was, killing his own people. I think the same argument was used on Gaddafi. He's killing his own people, so it was the responsibility of the United States, being the moral compass, the power for good in the world. Yeah, they felt it was their responsibility to go to Iraq or and even Libya to kind of, put an end on the brutality that was going on in that part of the world. Um, in recent events, we've seen a situation where some dictators, I'm talking of the case of Gabon, me being, born in Gabon, uh, I can tell you that for like over 50 years, uh, 56 to be exact, there have been one country ruling I mean, one family ruling the country and putting the, you know, with the complicity of France, of course, and a country that's supposed to be a tremendously rich in terms of natural resources. So, a gentleman in the army thought that, you know, this time, me and my friend were not going to be a subject to this regime to go and beat and kill people on the street, you know, after a rigged election. What we're going to do is to stand up and to put an end, to pose this guy. We're not going to kill him. We're not going to kill his people. We just have to put him aside and say enough is enough. But guess what happened? Guess what was the number one person to stand up and condemn Gabon? France. You know, you see the Commonwealth. I don't even know what's the role the Commonwealth is playing in a country that's supposed to be a francophone country, but that's a subject to another conversation. France rose up and say, "Hey, you know, we condemn the coup." But you just mentioned that the real coup, the real coup d'état, is what happened economically with France, looting this country since the beginning. We went to independence that was just on paper, political independence. Since 1960s, all these countries have been looted by France. That's the real economic scope. So now that you see the you know, French army leaving Mali, now that you see it more and more, there's an increase in coup d'etat, the military taking over and saying, you know, we're not going to apologize for this because we have to take our destiny in our own hands. Yeah, you're probably going to say coup d'etat or not democratic, which is you know, a bad proposition. But seeing what's going on in terms of those dictators that, you know, closely work with you know, this power, you know, like France. Should we continue to look at this coup with more understanding of the situation, or just condemn them and put some sanction on them, deprive them from the possibility for this the coup leaders, so-called coup leaders, to, you know, help to develop their countries? Because it's a lot of mixed messages. We started with that, you know, showing Cuba being a global force for good, you know, helping people during COVID, training people around the world. But it takes only one thing: somebody go over there, commit an act of terrorism. It's back to the United States. Been, you know, nobody do anything, but at the same time, you will see on the American soil people using, you know, acting, you know, very violently against the Cuban embassy, and you to on the ground, you don't see a lot of reaction. We don't see a lot of police, like when we see when we go to some protests in front of some embassy. So double standard from double standard upon double standards. So given that possibility, so my question here is that should we continue to condemn and deprive those coup leaders from, you know, organize the countries? You know, I'm talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, all of this kind of place that I mentioned, but including recently Gabon, that, you know, I've made a case that, hey, listen, this is exactly what the people have asked us for years. The people of Gabon have constantly said, we want the military to be on our side. The military should stop, you know, serving those dictators. The military have to stop serving the dictator, because the dictator is actually puppet from the Western and French being in this matter. So should we engage uh, these countries, the United States being one of them, to stop punishing these countries and trying
Well,
to help?
I think one thing we have to look at the U.S. history, because by definition, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, you would consider them as doing a military coup against Great Britain. Yet they held up as heroes in this country today.
Yeah,
So the question we have to ask ourselves is how is the U.S. government defining criminal acts? Because clearly, the law of the land before George Washington organized people here in the United States to fight against the British, the law of the land was the British law. So if we can see George Washington as a hero fighting against the unjust acts of Great Britain, how is it then that we cannot see the military in many of these countries now in Central and in West Africa that were former under the under the French control? How do we not see them as heroes and standing up and saying, no more? We do not want you to abuse our people anymore. And that we will remove as they did in the United States, they removed the British representative as being the supreme arbiter of what was right and what was wrong in the United States and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not playing that game anymore. So the United States is not even following its own history. And we're asked to forget our own history here in the United States. And that's something that we should not allow ourselves to do. We should not forget our own history here. Because
Absolutely.
again, if that was the case, I guess we would call George Washington a terrorist.
Right.
Okay. And clearly, I don't see any history books in the schools today calling George Washington a terrorist. So if we want to compare what's going on in Francophone Africa today to what went on back in the 1700s here in the United States, they're basically similar actions. And that is where the people got together and said, enough.
Yeah. Self-determination.
We're being victimized by another country, just like France has been victimizing the people in West and Central Africa. And the military is saying, enough.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We
Absolutely.
want you gone. We want you out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why is the United States supporting, which would have been equivalent to the British? Why are they supporting the French?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they
I
were
mean,
supporting the British during the time of George Washington.
right. But that's exactly what I was trying to stress. Um, you know, for many times we've seen war, America going to war, and the argument will be they're doing this for the people. And I mentioned in Iraq, 2021. George Bush making a case. Colin Powell demonstration at the UN. The basis of that war was, of course, there is a terrorism going on. We now know that Saddam Hussein was not behind, terrorism sponsors. He was not sponsoring terrorism, and we also know he didn't have weapon of mass destruction. But the fact that one of the selling argument was that Saddam Hussein is killing his own people using chemical
Well,
weapon, and that
I think the
the
question
United
we need
States
to
was
ask
supposed to
ourselves
come in.
about Saddam Hussein,
Yeah,
how was it that when Saddam Hussein was killing civilians in Iran for 10 years, he was considered a hero by the US government? But when he said, that's it, I'm ending this war with Iran, that's when he became a criminal in the eyes of the United States. The
absolutely.
United
So
States supplied Saddam Hussein with most of his weapons he used to fight against Iran. And that was an illegal war. And these were tax dollars that could have been used to address the issue of health care, better education, better housing, better health insurance. Instead, it was being used for weapons to kill people over in Iran for unjustified reasons. So when Saddam Hussein decides to stop that madness, that's when the United States said, hold on, we're going to call you a criminal.
Absolutely. So now that let just change gears here and talk about resources that African people often cry to have, but never benefits from it. We know a lot of these countries. We mentioned Mali. We know that a lot of light that you see, energy that you see, in France, for example, uranium is a part of the reason why central nuclear plants are working in France. And if there's light, Niger have to be responsible in order to allow the French to enjoy the lighting. And some expert will say Niger actually the source of that um, uh, you know uh, uranium materials is actually part of the Niger. It's not even they don't even have the light. So I want you to kind of comment on the fact that it has to be a time where African himself, beyond politics, has to have the capacity to transform the natural raw materials. We can go from oil, from diamond, from cocoa, and I know you're an expert in that particular area. Trying to bring us some knowledge on what
Well,
we can really do in order to bring some kind of economics
one of the things I think that we need to look at is that the standard of living in France today is because, not because France has a just economic system in France, they don't. But the reason why the standard of living for the average person in France, they're living as good as they're living today, is because of the wealth that France robs out of Africa. And we now to be also very, very clear that when France and the United States talks about terrorism in Northern Africa, in Mali, in Niger, many of these terrorists got their weapons from the unjustified war that United States and France carried out against Libya. So those weapons that the United States and France brought to Libya ended up in hands of terrorists fighting against the people and the government of Libya. And let's be very clear. When the United States and France and NATO invaded Libya had the highest standard of living in all of Africa. What do I mean by that? Well, if a family had a child, the government gave them $50,000 to support that child. If a person wanted to start and do agriculture in Libya, the government not only gave them the land, but gave them the equipment and the seeds to do the agriculture. The Libyan government took a country that was basically a desert and created an irrigation system, the biggest one in the history of Africa, that allowed for Libya to become a country with plush land because now it had water. All of that was destroyed. That irrigation system was a direct target of the bombing by the United States and France in Libya. Now, why would they destroy that? To, in fact, bring the economy of Libya to its knees. And it did. We have
So,
to look at many war crimes that are being committed, not just in Africa, the Caribbean, like Haiti, parts of Asia, done by the support of the NATO nations. The NATO nations went into Afghanistan for 20 years. And where is Afghanistan after they were there for 20 years? Are the people now well fed, with good health care, with developed roads and infrastructure? No. So the US government alone spent $2.3 trillion on that war. And who benefited from it? The military contractors. They're the ones who benefited from it. The people of Afghanistan didn't benefit from it. When the war that they carried out in Libya, who benefited from it? The military contractors. But the people of Libya's standards is drastically lower today than it's been in the last 35 years.
so basically, here's, you often say that um, not to be focused on, and this is one of your say when I talk to you off camera. You often says do not focus on the engineer, focus on the track, on the something
Yes,
like that.
yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong. So when you see the economic, let me take the example of something as simple as the production of cocoa, for example. Ivory Coast, Ghana. These are the major producers of cocoa. But yet, when you see how much these people get back from their, cocoa, is absolutely nothing for some countries in Europe that never cocoa don't grow in Europe. So how come European countries make more money on cocoa than these two countries that I just mentioned?
It's by design. And what do I mean by design? Europe uses Africa, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and many parts of Asia as the means of getting the raw materials that they need to process. And after they get those raw materials, they pay very, very little money for those raw materials, whether it's cocoa, oil, diamonds, gold, or what have you. Then they process it. Let me give you an example. The Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, produces 43% of all the cocoa in the world. Ghana produces 20% of all the cocoa in the world. Combined, they produce over 63% of all the cocoa in the world. The chocolate industry in the world generates about $135 to $140 billion a year. But these two countries that produce 63% of all the cocoa, they generate less than $6 billion out of a $135 to $140 billion industry. Do the math. They're being robbed. And then they turn around and they tell us over the news industry that these countries are poor. And I ask you a simple question. If I take your wallet from you by gunpoint, and now you have no more money, would you define yourself as being poor or being robbed?
That's the 1 million question that most
Right.
people,
Now to go
you know.
back, I want to finish one last piece that you brought up earlier.
Okay.
One of the problems we're often being taught to do is to pay attention to the engineer of the train
Right.
and not pay attention to what tracks the train is on. Now, most of us know that a train can only go wherever the tracks take it.
Right.
So if your goal is to go to New York and you're on the tracks that takes you to Chicago, I don't care how good your engineer is, you're not going to end up in New York. You're going to end up somewhere going in the direction of Chicago.
Yeah. No matter how smart your engineer, and
Right.
yeah.
And so they play the game is like a magician. They get you to look at one hand while the other hand is actually carrying out the magic act itself.
So
We
what can
need
possibly
to learn that
what
we
can
need
we
to
possibly
understand the
what can we
system.
possibly do, Mr. Paul? I understand that the analogy here, and you are. By the way, let me just say, hello to our friend, Mom Kum, who's watching from Ohio. Thank you for watching, and please share this live. Very important information that our friend Paul, who happened to be a senior political analyst, economics analyst here again TV. We're happy to see him back. So you successfully explain how African been robbed. You know, now situation didn't go away. We're still in this situation. If you ought to talk to some of these leaders about something simple. I'm not even talking about diamond because it takes a lot of skills, mining, whatever stuff. Cocoa, this is some fruit from some trees. You train people how to process this efficiently, and then you do it yourself. What has been the problem with African countries not being able to transform, to process their own raw materials, their own goods? What can we do?
Again, what happens with most of the African countries is they're on the wrong track. You take people that, for example, live in the United States. Say, for example, they're from Gabon, but they live in the United States, or even a citizen of the United States.
Right.
My question would be, if I had cocoa in my country where I came from, I would probably try to go to school to learn how to make premium chocolate. That's putting myself on the right track. Why is that? Because if I have that knowledge and I take it back to my country, I increase the value of the cocoa in my country. I want to hear the number now, over 4,000 times. Let me repeat that number. You increase the value of your cocoa over 4,000 times. So if you're making $50,000 for 22 tons, if you're able to turn that cocoa into premium chocolate, you were making in the millions of dollars, not hundreds of thousands, but in the millions of dollars off of that same 22 tons of cocoa. And just keep in mind, when you're making premium chocolate, what do you need? Well, you need cocoa, yes. You need sugar, yes. You may need coconut, yes. Passion fruit, yes. Almonds, yes. Guess what? All of that is grown in Africa.
Nothing in Europe.
It's not grown in Europe, it's grown in Africa. It's not grown in Canada, it's grown in Africa. So what they're doing is they're buying all the raw materials to make chocolate and then shipping it to Europe, make the chocolate, and then turn around and sell it back to us at an extremely high price. So,
Wow.
again, getting on the right track, if you're here, and I say this to any African from any country that's over here. If you're from Nigeria, you're from Ghana, you're from the Ivory Coast, you're from Senegal, all these countries grow cocoa. Why not learn how to make your chocolate and bring that added value back home? I'll give you another example. Most of us have heard of a company called Starbucks.
Yep.
Starbucks.
Absolutely. Starbucks
What does
coffee.
Starbucks make its money off of?
Coffee, mainly.
Coffee, cocoa, and tea. Now, does coffee grow in the United States?
No.
No. Does cocoa grow in the United States?
No.
No. Does tea grow in the United States?
No.
No. So my point is, I would go look for a job where I could be an apprentice, learning how to roast coffee, how to blend coffee. Why? Because first thing I would do to get on the right track is go back home and use that skill to put an added value to my coffee that's grown back home. Same
Yep.
thing with same thing with cocoa and chocolate. Okay, like I said earlier, if you're going to make premium chocolate, what is in premium chocolate? Raw sugar,
Hmm.
grown back home in Africa. Coconut, grown back home in Africa. Passion fruit, grown back home in Africa. Sugar, grown back home in Africa. So everything you need to make the chocolate exists.
And the numbers are saying is saying that it's gonna cocoa. I mean, chocolate is gonna be so expensive in the years come. The price keep going. I was looking at some of the you know I mean the numbers here in the United States. Every single year is the price of chocolate will go up. Will go up. So if we're not listening, paying attention to this, and say, "Hey, listen, this is valuable information." All we need to do is to understand that everything that Starbucks do, Starbucks at its final analysis, it looks like Starbucks is the middleman because
Yeah,
there's
my point
nothing.
is that okay, so now you set up your coffee boutique.
Yeah,
You get your coffee out of Tanzania, or out of Kenya, or out of the Congo, or out of Cameroon, or wherever. It's going to be near the equator. And you bring it over here to the United States. You've learned how to roast it, you've learned how to blend it, and now you sell the coffee. People who drink coffee, they drink the coffee because they like the taste. So if you're in a position where you now can roast it the way people like it, that you can blend it the way people like it, then you have direct access. That's what I'm talking about when I say the train track. But
right,
also,
absolutely.
let's keep in mind, what is the real goal? The real goal is to develop Africa. So your
Yeah,
goal is not to sit back and see if you can become a billionaire and walk around with your chest stuck out, because that's not helping Africa. That's taking you again to Chicago rather than to New York.
Right. So
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 we want
I
to be
think
able,
part of the solution, as you mentioned, and not to cut you off, part of the solution will be is to put together some kind of training. Put together some schools where training where African themselves learn how to cut diamonds, to process premium chocolate themselves, and even sugar for that matter, and then they'll be able to take on this industry themselves. But
well, let me give you an example.
yeah,
There's a
go ahead.
lot of discussion today about reparations.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely. Good one.
Now you can very easily get on the wrong track with reparations.
Right.
Say they give African people $100 billion. Okay. Now, if people use that money to go buy themselves a brand new car, a big fancy house, or whatever that doesn't generate any additional income,
Hmm.
they're on the wrong track. On the other hand, if they use that money to learn how to process the cocoa, the coffee, how to smelter gold into jewelry, how to cut diamonds into jewelry, how to, in fact, take the different resources that Africa has to offer us today and process it that brings about added value. Then rather than that money shrinking because all we did was spend it on something that added no extra value to us.
Absolutely. Listen, brother. We are probably out of time. Almost 52 minutes past. It's a great conversation. Something we're not gonna be talking just one day. I want to take some of the comments here. Miss Kumba was saying people in the United States consume nearly 500 million cups of coffee each day. According to the NCA, American drink approximately 491 cups of coffee every year. That is tremendously a lot. And this is just the United States, speaking of how, the coffee is being used around the world. The point that Mr. Paul has been trying to make is that none of those European countries, including America, have plantations where coffee grow. So how come, you know, uh, industries like Starbucks are tremendously rich from the materials that come to Africa? Why, while African himself continue to starve to death, continue to cry, to be put aside, being calling names like being poor. And Mr. Paul says, clearly, if you have a pocket, you have a wallet with full of money, and somebody steal it, or you poor, or you just been robbed. So I'm going to bring Mr. Paul back here to give us some conclusion on this tremendous, amazing conversation that I believe should be on almost every day, so our people can be aware of what's going on. Mr. Paul, now,
Yeah.
we've been saying
Yeah.
so.
To sum up, what I'm saying is this:
Absolutely. Go ahead.
people of African descent should look around and see what items, what commodities are either grown in Africa or come out of the ground in Africa that ends up with a lot of added value to it. Whether it's the coltan that they use for cell phones, or the cobalt that they use for batteries, or the cocoa that they use for premium chocolate. We should be, if we're now living in Europe or the United States or Canada, to get on the right track, we should be learning how to process all this and take that knowledge back home.
Go ahead.
Because if we take that knowledge back home, we now will be the ones putting on the added value. Not Europe, not Canada, not Australia, not China, not Russia, not the United States. But we will be the ones that will have that added value. And with that added value, we can truly build Africa compete with other countries in Europe or in the countries in the North, as they describe it, whether it's Canada, United States, Europe, Russia, or China. China did that. That's why China's economy today is so well developed. We need to learn how to get on the right track. And if we do that, we will solve many of our problems we have today.
Abs- Absolutely. Hey, listen, brother Paul, always a pleasure to have you, sir. And just like our friends here, I'm gonna read real quickly. What she was saying. People, we read that already. She said, Dear Paul, thank you for bringing this to the table because we are talking taking a deep look. The consumers are dependent on the producers. However, African are not playing the right role in this game. Absolutely. As you mentioned again, adding the value to our raw materials. Absolutely. And also adding value to a skill, to values and skill to the African people. Tremendous contribution, Miss Kumba. Thank you so much. And the others that have a chance to watch this show. Mr. Paul is a strategic and also senior political analyst in economics on again TV Plus. Yeah, something to say real quick before we leave the show. Real
One
quick.
quick thing.
Go ahead.
Our future is not with Bitcoin. Our future is learning how do we process the resources that we grow and have in our grounds. And if we do that, then we, in fact, will be able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Okay.
Absolutely. We're gonna leave right there, Mr. Paul. This is gonna be another occasion for us to go even deeper. My friend, thank you again for coming. Look forward to speak with you another time. Bye now.